the first thing that comes to mind before I hand this over is in health and wealth, I think sometimes just defining who the customer is a challenge. Ownership over the customer in these industries is a challenge. And Lisa and Edna are going to talk about the importance of getting all of your customers involved and getting feedback from all of them. And then we're happy to take questions towards the end or as we go. Feel free to pop something into chat, and then after Lisa and Edna are done, we'll unmute everything. So thanks, and Edna, if you want to take it away.
Sure. Go ahead and move it to the next slide. This really underlines what Lisa was just saying. And before I get started, I should say, welcome everyone. I see a lot of familiar names on here, so it's really good to see you all. It's been a while since I've talked to some of you. So excited to talk about customer experience programs. This is something that we've been doing for a long time at Greenwald. And just because of the complexities of our industries that we typically work in, health and wealth, we thought it merited an actual methodology conversation. So what we wanted to do is start at the basics. What is customer experience research in our industries? Well, it's very confusing. There are lots of different stakeholders. The actual consumer in the end may not even be given a choice or given very limited choices as to what services or products they end up consuming. And certainly throughout their entire journey, they are being touched by many different people. And so knowing what has the biggest influence on that customer satisfaction, their likelihood to recommend, their willingness to come back and buy your product again, if it's even a choice that they have, is a challenging one. I'll let you move forward. So that said, it's possible, right? And we do it all the time. And I think that the biggest piece that if you walk away with nothing else today, it's to understand that a customer experience program in our industries really needs to touch all of your stakeholders, all of the ones that matter and all of the ones that really contribute to the bottom line satisfaction of a customer. So here's a sampling of some of those different stakeholders. And we'll talk about how they all kind of interconnect throughout this presentation. And Lisa Weber will be giving some thoughts on how to kind of measure the success of these different interactions. But that's really what we wanted you to take away today. Move forward. So when we are engaged to either redesign an existing customer experience program or start one, and sometimes it's a bit of each, right? We follow a 6-step process, which I guess you could call our framework. And that framework starts big picture and moves down to the nitty gritty. So starting at the big picture, it's really understanding your program goals and how they fit into your business context, understanding what stakeholders are involved, and then moving down through, okay, what are the typical metrics of success that you would use to measure the actual success of what you're doing, and moving down the funnel. What we'll do today is walk through these 6 steps at a pretty high level. Happy to answer questions at the end, but also feel free to reach out anytime afterwards. So starting at that big picture, the business context, too often we see bloated research programs where there are so many different surveys happening, too many touch points, too many people being asked, too many questions. And what happens is the results end up on a shelf collecting dust. That's not our goal and not how we like to work. We like to make sure that whatever we're doing with you is something that's actionable. So we always kind of start off at the high level to understand what are your business goals, what is the context that you're working in, what is the value that you think you're providing to the market and that you want to be providing to the market. And knowing these things can help us structure a program that's comprehensive and really understands all the different stakeholders involved and how it can all lead to your own bottom line. So an example would be telemedicine. Telemedicine is fundamentally a technology product. Technology companies tend to be very innovative and creative. And if you think about how they're structured, they focus a lot of their time and energy on the talent that they have internally. And that talent is really what drives the value to the end customer. If you don't have the right talent internally, being creative, cutting edge, and developing new technology that's going to work for the customer, it won't really matter anything else down the line. So having that stakeholder involved in your customer experience program is an example of kind of a 360 view of a customer experience program that's actually going to matter and impact your bottom line. We're going to go through some of these others now. Lisa?
Yeah, great. Thanks, Edna. And I'll add that, often we find when we're working with our clients, the importance is that re in the parentheses there. We're constantly revisiting those program goals, those business objectives as your business changes. So it's really not a one-time thing. So when we talk about metrics of success, there are a bunch of questions we likely would ask you. Right? What does success mean to your organization? What does your leadership care about? What has been tied back to sales? Have you tied any of the metrics back to sales or renewals? Or maybe what has your analysis that you've done shown that your employees, your frontline workers, the people interacting with your different stakeholders, what can they most influence? What do they have the most ability to push or pull or drive? What do you even know about the ability of your employees to push or pull key metrics? I could talk a lot about the pros and cons of each of these common metrics that we see in the health and wealth space, especially in those markets and the different audiences that we're reaching. But I think the takeaway here is it's really important to think critically about exactly what it is you are asking people to answer in the context in which they sit. You really have to put yourself into the shoes of your customer, your brokers, your providers, your agents, whoever that is, to think about whether each of these is honestly answerable by them. So I'm not going to go through all of these, happy to chat more about them at the end, but really, so we think about satisfaction, right? This is a really flexible measure. A lot of people can answer this. It can fit across different contexts, different touch points. But the negative or the con of satisfaction is, what does that mean? What actually does it mean when someone is satisfied? So there are pros and cons to each of these, but it's important to talk those through and really think about what your organization is aiming for and align those metrics with that.
So the next step in the process after we've, working down this funnel, understanding the business context that you're sitting in, your overall business goals, what you're trying to influence, and then setting the metrics against that is to map out who you're talking to and who matters. So, a consumer experience is going to be impacted by a lot of different people. And we find value in creating a program that usually measures the experience of all of those different parties. So here's an example of a member journey that would be in healthcare. All the way from choosing which insurance plan to buy, usually happens through their employer, so the employer is involved in that, all the way through actually using the services and paying for them, whatever their portion is. So this journey, if you think about it, is touching a lot of different people, and it is important to be able to measure the impact of all of those different people on the end consumer and their experience, but it's also important to understand all of those different stakeholders and what their experience is as well. If a provider is having a negative experience with a certain carrier, for example, they are not going to be happy to work with them, and perhaps they would even cancel their relationship with them or become a less preferred provider. A concierge vendor that is selling its services through an employer, if they are not enjoying the experience that they're looking for with their customers, they're going to be another stakeholder that you want to be able to measure. So really understanding that member journey and all the different touch points that they have, that will also feed back to the ultimate end consumer's experience. So if you go to the next page, this is kind of how we think about health insurance as an example, and it just happens to be the space I work in. So, but I think it's something that could be looked at also through a financial services lens or even in employee benefits. There's so many different parties involved that you really need to understand how all of them fit into your customer experience program. Lisa Greenwald, feel free to comment, by the way, on the financial services space. It's one of the reasons we invited Lisa here with us today. I'm sure she has some thoughts as to how this applies.
Great. So this really, we're at step 5, right? Talking about the research plan. That's a lot of steps that we haven't even started to talk about research, because it's really important to think holistically about your goals and level set on those before you start to build a program. And when we say program, we are thinking holistically. You have got to strike some sort of balance, honestly. There will always be more questions. There will always be more business needs that pop up that have to be dealt with. But unfortunately, none of us have unlimited audiences. So we have to be really critical and creative thinkers in terms of who we're going to ask what and when and how. We really have to be efficient and we have to be thorough. So thinking about efficiency, what is a must know versus a nice to know? And that is something that I constantly am bringing up when I'm talking to clients about questions they want to add to a questionnaire. You can't have a really huge survey. You're going to get poor quality data. That's just the name of the game. So when you have too many metrics, you wind up with a survey that doesn't really work for you very well. You wind up with metrics that aren't used. You wind up with questions that are measuring the same thing. And we have techniques to diagnose those things and help you whittle that down. But you also have to be thorough. You have to understand what your end goals are as an organization, what the needs are, and how to strategically get there. So we really need to think about whether we need to ask someone a question or if there is data that we can leverage in another way and be creative. Is there data from internal metrics, big data, creative analysis that we can do rather than asking people a laundry list of questions? And we need to think about those people, those stakeholders that we really need to get a perspective from. Are they willing? How many are there? Do they have the time or the bandwidth? And what is the best way to reach them? We often find ourselves being a little bit of a ruthless advisor with our clients in really forcing them to whittle down and think strategically about exactly what they're asking, of who, when, and how many surveys, frankly, they're putting out there, how much research they're doing to really balance that. It is part of thinking through a bigger program. You really do have to think about all of the different research that you're doing and almost layer it on top of that journey that Edna just showed you so that you can get an understanding of where your gaps are and understanding maybe what a strategic initiative is and start to layer in where you want to go, perhaps what you want to address given your budget, the goals for that year. And the next slide, how do we do this? What happens in practice? It's a lot of work, honestly. We really try to almost use our research skills to research you, the client, your organization, your goals, what things you're doing. So that's all of the first, sort of 4 to 5 steps in our process. And we're constantly gathering that feedback and checking in and creating a partnership. And part of that creates a few steps that we always like to go through. We do always like to do an annual program and questionnaire audit. So thinking holistically again about, okay, what do we know? Who do we know it from? And what are we missing? Are there questions that we have on our questionnaire that we never used? Who still needs them? Anyone? We like to look at it from a 360 view. So are you getting all of that relevant feedback so you can drive real results in your organization? Do you have a blind spot? Have you never gotten the perspective of a broker, and perhaps half of your sales are coming through brokers with groups or employers? We like to look at the flexibility. So we think about questionnaires in terms of not being locked in and always there. We try to use our methodological skills to think about having some core questions that are always asked and are not tampered with to try and preserve and protect that trend, but allow you some flexibility to talk about a hot topic that might fall by the wayside in 6 months or so. And we're living this right now with COVID. I'm sure there's plenty of people that were like, oh, let's add some COVID questions to our SAT tracker. Let's get a read on that. And maybe that wasn't the best way to ask about it. Maybe there's some data that you were able to integrate across your platform when you took a step back and looked at your program holistically, so that you maybe can balance that thoroughness of needing to address the elephant in the room of COVID, but being efficient and not having to ask your people even more questions and increase your survey length. And then of course, I'm a quant person. So I love my numbers, but I do have to give sort of a shout out to the qual side, because it is really important to balance both qual and quant in your program. And the reason I think is twofold. Stories do resonate with people, videos, quotes in their own words. It really, when you hear the hope or frustration of a consumer or an employer, that doesn't just, one, help you understand where they're coming from and the quant results that you're getting, but two, it actually helps you sell research internally. It helps put words and faces with your employees, your frontline, your call center, and also your executives. Those stories really resonate. So we find that blending the qual and quant, when you take a step back and look at a comprehensive CX program, is really critical. So I'll pause there. We'll turn it over to Lisa Greenwald.
All right. Well, I'm going to start with some questions for the team, but all of our participants, please feel free to jump in. This absolutely does apply, of course, to the financial services world as well. I mean, one of the things that, I'm constantly thinking about when it comes to CX is an individual product versus a group product. And on the individual side, when you're talking about health and wealth, I do question whether or not likelihood to recommend is really the best metric, right? People are still pretty guarded in talking about their financial situations and details of their health situation, insurance in general. It's not something you see a lot of social media buzz about like you would a consumer packaged good product, right? So if as a society we're still pretty reluctant to talk about these things, we're probably just overall reluctant to recommend in general. And so on the individual side, that's something that I always think about when I'm looking at likelihood to recommend and NPS. But NPS is, for the vast majority of our clients, one of the key metrics, if not the only metric really being looked at with customer experience. And Lisa, on the group side, for health, but I think it also applies to benefits and retirement plans. What are your views on the use of NPS?
I could do a whole coffee break on this. I really don't think it's applicable. And the reason I don't think it's applicable on a consumer side is they don't have a choice. And so when you think about how they're obtaining benefits, health insurance, maybe even your financial service 401k provider, that decision is out of their hands. And so when you are asking a consumer, oh, how likely would you be to recommend company to your family and friends, they're having in their mind, well, I didn't get to pick my health insurance carrier or my 401k provider. My friend, family member works for, Joe Schmo Corporation. I don't know who they have. How could I possibly recommend this when they don't have the choice? However, likelihood to recommend might be a great option when you talk about brokers or agents, and they're the ones putting carriers or plan providers in front of employers and plan sponsors. Maybe that is the place where likelihood to recommend and NPS is a place to put that.
So NPS belongs with the people who actually have a choice. But so NPS tracking quant in general, I think is the core of most of our clients' customer experience. But, you know, Edna, what are the other parts? Is it just trackers?
Very good question. I, of course, live in the world of qual, and so my answer is always throw some qual in there. It gives you the color, right? It gives you the other side of the coin. There's so much you can get from a tracker, but what you can't get is going to be the dig in. It's not going to give you the why they answered that, and you can put in a lot of open ends that help solve for it. But there's other ways you can get at it a lot more successfully. If we're going to talk about that broker audience where they are making a lot of those decisions, just getting an NPS score and some context around that is not going to be as powerful as, for instance, a win-loss program, which I would consider as almost part of a CX program, right? If you can get a really good win-loss program put into place where you are talking to not only the brokers and those intermediaries, but also the employers who are maybe selecting the plans, you're going to get a very good view of what they think is working for your company and your products and why they would recommend or not recommend it. So that's one area I would definitely do. Obviously, sales ride-alongs are also really interesting. And usually this comes out of a win-loss study, right? In a win-loss study, you might find out that you have all the right products. It's appropriately priced, it's competitively priced even, but it just fails during that, the actual finalist presentation step. Okay, well then a survey is not gonna be what does the work there. It's gonna be interviews, it's gonna be sales ride-along, shadowing, really watching the people in action and understanding what's working, what's not working. So I think there's a lot of qual that can be layered on to really understand the results you're seeing in the tracker surveys.
Well, thanks. So we started off talking about all of those stakeholders. And I think one of the things we see often is there are surveys potentially for all of those stakeholders. But perhaps because of the siloed nature of so many of our client companies, the people looking at agent or broker surveys are not the same people looking at consumer surveys. So Lisa and Edna, what are your thoughts on best practices for integrating the results from all of that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And I think that's where it's critical that whatever you want to call them, corporate researchers, analysis, strategy, insights, all of those buzzwords, wherever they sit, they're really sort of the people that can help integrate. They have the skills to help integrate all of the pieces and see the big picture. And I think it is critical to tie all of that together given the strategy. Edna, would you agree with that?
I think that's where we've seen the most success is when someone owns it at that level and is able to pull in all of the right parties, whether it's in the business units, the product lines, whatever it is. If they can pull that together and be that central point of contact and have the overall view, then they can build the program that's going to work and actually move a needle. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of siloed results that, you know, aren't going to really tie into anything in terms of improving metrics.
And it's hard. It's a hard transition, especially if you are used to each, you know, party doing their own thing. And we've had clients go through this transition and they take a step back and realize, okay, business unit A is doing a survey of this group and business unit B is doing a survey of the same group at the same time, touching on the same topics. And so it really does take that holistic view. And it is hard. It is a challenge, but if it's done well, it can really boost the visibility of sort of strategic research internally.
Mm-hmm.